So in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges that I face every year being on such a small scale is shade. I can't just turn the animals out into a pasture and let them find their own shade. Managing them on such a intensive level and keeping them confined in these square foot chunks and strip grazing them throughout a larger pasture, inevitably they're going to end up in an area that's doesn't have any shade on it. I will say straight up, I think if you're on a micro scale, if you're on a small scale, the best, in my opinion, the best thing to do would be to find mobile shade, whether that's something that you purchase or something that you build. I know there's some plans out there online, and there's some, to build your own, and there's some companies that have gone all out with mobile shade that is actually pretty expensive. But that way, if they're in a small chunk for a certain amount of time and there's zero shade in that chunk, you can obviously bring in that shade. The genetics of your animals and whether or not they have any crossbreeding influence with certain breeds of cattle that are more tolerable to heat and humidity, that plays the biggest factor. The other thing is hide color. There's days like it's starting to get pretty warm now. Both the red steer and that dun Dexter, Big Abby, we call her Fat Abby because she's super heavy. They're standing out in the sun right now grazing, and the two black-hided animals are actually laying down underneath tree cover. I know you can't see it, but again, I talked about having the tree line on the outside of the pasture on both ends basically, and if we were going into July or August, sometimes it gets, you have those weeks where it's 100 plus degrees for like a week straight. I know in a previous video I said that those long narrow strips really don't work, and they don't, but if I knew that I was going to have a week of 100 plus degrees for the majority of the day, another option that I have done is giving them a very narrow strip, and that whole, in this pasture it's 400 feet east to west, that whole 400 foot. So in the morning they can hang out on the east side, as the sun's coming up and kind of getting high in the sky, they can hang out under the trees on the east side, and as that sun tracks south and comes over to the west, and the shade on the west side starts to give, or the trees on the west side start to give shade, then they can travel the 400 feet to the west and hang out underneath the shade over there. So again, it's not ideal, very, very narrow, very, very long, very, very long strips. But if I know I'm only going to be doing it for a week, then I consider that something okay to do. And again, you're moving them off each narrow strip every day, so they really aren't going to do that much damage. So I'm standing, right at about 200 feet here, and I guess some more clarification on those long narrow strips. Using my current figures, my current numbers for my strip sizes this spring, 400 feet, right now would get me 40 feet wide, 100 foot long, which gives me basically 4 grazing cells. So essentially 2 days. So one strip setup with the poly wire gets me 2 days. I just have to back fence it in 4 different cells, 2 moves each day. The easiest thing to do, again, if I had a high heat situation, as you can see, like the shade is really starting to set in right here, maybe only give them 20 feet wide instead of going 40 feet wide, give them 20 feet wide, and then 200 feet long. That still gets me, kind of that 4,000 square feet. And so then that way, again, in the morning time, they can hang out over here. They can use this tree line for shade. They'll get half of the pasture worth for the morning. And then as the sun starts, like I said, as the sun starts to work its way towards the west, they can kind of chase that sun. Now when I come down for the afternoon move, and again, if it ends up, I open up that afternoon chunk at 1 instead of 3 or whatever, then I open up that afternoon chunk. Now they can continue on for the last 200 feet, get down to this tree line for their evening graze, and now they're using the shade down here because the sun has moved. So I thought this would be a good view to kind of show the tactic that I have to use when they're in this front pasture. I'm standing up here on my deck, and so obviously the house is behind me. So there's no tree line, there's no shade that they get for the first half of the day, because you know the strips really will end right here, and they'll work their way up a little bit, but there's nothing over here on the east side. So that first half of the day there's zero shade. So what I'll do, and I have a different view of it in a video that I'll add on after this, but basically what I'll do is you know, these strips are running east to west, and I work my way from the south all the way to the north. So every single one of those strips then opens up into a permanent lane that I have created along this wooden fence line. If you watched my video about fence, you know, I mentioned it's usually about 10 or 12 feet off of that wooden fence line. So this tree line here, right by this fence line, provides shade starting at about, you know, 11 o'clock or noon every day, especially during the middle of summer. The animals will have access to that permanent lane all day, every day. So every strip has an outlet that gets them back into that permanent lane, and then they can walk up and down this fence line essentially and kind of chase that shade throughout the day. There also is an opening right there, and that creates another basically permanent alleyway, a permanent lane running up along that fence line. And all of these trees here provide great shade cover throughout the day. So if it gets hot enough, you know, there are certain hours of the day when only a handful of those trees on that back fence line will provide good shade. They can keep on walking up that strip, punch through that little opening back there in the corner, and then they have this whole strip that they can work themselves up and down and take cover from the sun. So this is a view just kind of looking down the fence line. So that strip, that alleyway that I set up for them would be about, you know, 10 or 12 feet off of this fence line. So they'd have enough room to walk up and down, get past each other, lay down in the shade. But at certain times of the year and certain times of the day, it's not enough shade for all the animals to take cover. So what I'll do is I run that lane along the fence line all the way up, and then this is that opening that I was showing earlier. So this red fence opens up and it blocks off the rest of this trail to get down to the back pasture. So they can come through that opening, and then they have access to this permanent lane here. These trees right here, you know, they overhang this lane most of the day. So it provides good shade all hours of the day. As you can see though, it is pretty beat up, and I don't know if you could see it earlier, but you know, anytime you give your animals 24/7 access to an area, they're gonna really beat it up. And they haven't been on this area for a long time now, but you can still see this cattle trail, just kind of what they take when they walk the fence line. You know, as the season progresses and the summer picks up, and I set up this lane, this whole, like I said, 10 or 12 feet off the fence line is just gonna be beat up. It's gonna be really compacted. The grass growth is gonna be really poor. It's definitely an ungrazable, you know, 10, 12 feet. So we're back in that back pasture, and it's about 10 o'clock in the morning, and as you can see, there's a good amount of shade that's coming off of this eastern tree line here. So one of the strategies that I'll use is I always try and start their morning chunk will always come from the east side, so that way they can always kind of get back to this tree line over here and take shelter if they need to earlier in the day. So when they're going to end up in chunks, let's say in the middle of this pasture that is going to have no access to shade, I won't back fence it. And really, I'll only do it to areas that they have grazed less than 2 days before. When you get to that third day, the grass plant actually starts to grow back. And the last thing you want is for them to turn around, head back, and start eating on that grass that's just started to regrow, because that's really going to hurt it. So, you know, during the middle of the summer when the moisture is down and the temperatures are up, it might take a little bit longer. I'll push it to 3 days. I'll let them back into an area that they were at 3 days ago, but definitely no more than 3 days. And like I said, I really try and keep it 2 days or less. So this would allow me to let them back into stuff that they were at the day before that might still have shade in it. So that's it, guys. I mean, I know pretty much all the ideas that I shared in this video are pretty basic, pretty obvious. I mean, this stuff isn't groundbreaking. It's taken me a few seasons to kind of figure out my shade system and what's going to work for me. And ultimately what it comes down to is how your pastures are laid out, where your shade's going to be, how big your herd size is, how much land you have. And at the end of the day, because we're working on such a small scale and we're trying to do things regeneratively, and we know that prolonged grazing is bad for the soil, we're just going to have to get over that there's going to be some areas that the cows are going to hang out in longer than we want them to, because that's where their shade cover is coming from. A good example is right here. This whole strip behind me where the cows are now laying down in the shade has been open to them for 3 days now, and it's going to be a fourth tomorrow. We had what went from a few days of 90 degrees to now we're looking at an entire 7 days, an entire week of over 90 degrees. And they just happen to be in an area this week when that weather's rolling in that they're not going to get shade as they progress out further into the pasture. So I'm electing not to back fence, and they're going to keep coming into this area, and they've already grazed it down more than it makes me comfortable. But at the end of the day, a small sliver in my pasture that might be worked over a little bit more is not as bad as animals that are unhealthy and uncomfortable and will lead to other issues. Which brings up a point that last night I was reading an article that heat stress can actually reduce effective breeding rates anywhere from 20 to 40%. And because we AI every year, and the AI is such a regimented schedule, and if you miss that window of opportunity to attempt to get that animal bred, you're looking at another 20 plus or minus few days before you can do it again. And trying to have a tight calving schedule and calve during a certain time of the year, I can't afford to miss more than a couple cycles. So just the thought of, okay, I'm going to beat up this strip a little bit more than I want, but at the end of the day, it's going to keep them comfortable. That's fine with me, because again, it's going to pay dividends. I mean, 40% increase in the probability of having an effective conception rate. Shoot, I'll keep the cows on one spot all day long if it means that I'm guaranteed calves this time next year. Some of the other key points that this article pointed out that I hadn't even thought about, I might as well share them with you guys. One thing to consider is an effective fly control program during the grazing season. If the flies get really bad, the cows will kind of bunch up to combat flies together. They'll stand nose to tail, use each other's head throws and tail swishes to clear flies off each other. But that obviously gets them hot because they're bunched up and the airflow isn't as great. So having an effective fly control program, holy cow, that's a mouthful, can make a big difference. The other thing that they talked about, your timing of feeding. So I like to move them twice a day, and I know the cows like to be moved twice a day, and that's obviously the system that we're trying to go for, to give them a strip, move them off that strip. But choosing to feed or give them their allotment for the day later on in the afternoon when it's really hot could be a benefit as well, because we all know that digestion as the cow ruminates actually builds body heat. So if they eat in the morning and then it gets super hot by noon, 1, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and that is kind of when their body is going through that digestion, that's just going to skyrocket their internal temperature even more. So maybe feeding them in the late afternoon, so when that digestion heat starts to be produced, it's happening in the cooler hours of the evening or overnight. So I think, in my opinion, the two best things that we all can do when it comes to dealing with heat tolerance and shade on our micro ranches is, the first would be genetics and hide color. That's going to have probably the biggest impact. If you can start with animals that are going to be genetically better at dealing with heat, or a different hide color that's not going to bake in the sun as much, that's going to set you up for success whether or not you have adequate shade. And then the second thing is that mobile shade. I think that'll be the avenue that I'm going to start exploring probably this winter. I'm going to seriously look into what it'll take to put some mobile shade out here. Again, whether that's something I'm going to buy or build myself, but us trying to do this again on those small chunks of land to avoid situations like this, to where the animals are now going to be exposed to the same area for multiple days at a time. I think that mobile shade is going to be the ticket. So I hope this video helped. I hope it sparked some ideas and kind of got you guys thinking of maybe some unconventional ways that you can provide shade to your animals on a very small scale. And if you have any questions or you want me to highlight anything further, just, you know, leave a comment or a question down below. I'm trying to get back to everyone. I really appreciate all the interaction that you guys are having. I think we're all in this together, just trying to take what we hear and what we read and what we see on these really large ranches and shrink it down to make it work for our small acres is a challenge that we're all facing. So I'm totally open to any suggestions you guys have, any ideas that you're using, and I appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll catch you at the next one.